我宣布
The 9,857th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are at a very important moment in the unfolding political situation in Syria. Let me first update you on where these things stand when it comes to the transition. On 29 January, a broad range of military factions assembled in Damascus and issued a declaration dissolving the 2012 constitution, exceptional laws, the former parliament, the former army, all previous security agencies, former regime-allied militias, and the Ba'ath Party. The declaration said that all revolutionary and military factions, including notably civil and political revolutionary bodies, were dissolved and were to be integrated into state institutions. Mr. Ahmed al-Shara was declared, and I quote, interim president and head of state for a transitional period, end of quote. And the declaration authorized him to establish and appoint a provisional legislative council. Mr. President, the next day, on 30th January, Mr. al-Shara made an address to the nation in which he pledged to do the following, and I quote, work to form a comprehensive transitional government that expresses the diversity of Syria, its men, women, and youth, end of quote. And he said he would also work towards free and fair elections. He mentioned as specific steps that he would announce a preparatory committee to select a small legislative council, after which he would announce a constitutional declaration to serve as the legal reference for the transitional phase. He also said a preparatory committee for a national dialogue conference would be formed. He has spoken in the media of free and fair elections taking place in 4 to 5 years. The caretaker authorities subsequently briefed me on these issues in more detail and said that we would expect moves in a very short space of time. And indeed today, the establishment of the preparatory committee for the National Dialogue Conference was officially announced. The leadership of the caretaker authorities have repeatedly committed publicly and to me that the new Syria will be for all Syrians and build on inclusive and credible foundations. And given the specific roadmap being laid out as regards governance, constitution, and elections, the words of the caretaker authorities show considerable overlap with the key principles of Security Council Resolution 2254. The key, of course, will be implementation. Mr. President, I have made it clear to the caretaker authorities that my mission stands ready to offer counsel and support, as does the entire UN family. And I went through the full range of areas where support can remain ready to work meaningfully and constructively on the next steps with the caretaker authorities, as was agreed, in support of a Syrian-led process in line with the key principles of Security Council Resolution 2254. Mr. President, while in Syria, I met a diverse range of representatives, groups, and individuals from all parts of the country, involved in a full range of political, community, religious, and organizational activities. I was deeply struck by the shared conviction among all the Syrians I met that the success of Syria's political transition is essential and that it cannot afford to fail. All understand it may be imperfect, but many are concerned that there has been no rule of law, been no constitutional or legal framework for appointments and policy decisions, nor systematic communication or transparency. Some express concerns that the caretaker authorities are taking decisions that go beyond a caretaker mood, including in terms of restructuring state institutions with potential impact on specific communities. All Syrians with whom I met welcomed the public commitments of the caretaker authorities over the past 2 months, but want these to be translated into concrete steps. I heard many stress to me how much they want institutional appointments, the transitional government, the provisional legislative body, the national dialogue process, and any preparatory committees. And that these needs to be credible and inclusive with the participation of all segments of society, ideally identified by a transparent process of consultations and a clear and time-bound roadmap forwards on next steps, including a constitutional process and towards free and fair elections and on transitional justice too, as Mr. Shara himself has promised. Mr. President, many Syrians, men and women, expressed concern at reports of discriminatory practices targeting women and of increasing social pressure towards certain norms. Of course, we have seen caretaker authorities reassure women on their rights, and in some instances we have seen those involved in discriminatory practices detained. But Syrian women also want more than protection. They want meaningful participation in decision-making or appointments in key positions based on their qualifications. They want to participate in transitional institutions so that their perspectives are considered, including on issues related to the status and rights of Syrian women. Mr. President, it is important to underscore that the current efforts towards a political transition are unfolding in a situation of territorial division and hot conflict in northeast Syria, which is extremely concerning. There are still daily frontline hostilities impacting civilians and civilian infrastructure, exchanges of artillery and airstrikes, and a series of car bombs in mostly residential areas, prompting serious civilian casualties. I welcome that the caretaker authority and the SDF opened a direct channel, even if progress has not yet emerged. I strongly encourage, Mr. President, the US, Turkey, and regional and Syrian partners to work together on genuine compromises that enable peace and stability to take hold in northeast Syria. It is vital to avoid further conflict, which could have drastic effects on Syrian civilians, stability, the economy, the transition, the fight against ISIL, and potentially international peace and security. And it is crucial that all doors remain open to ensuring the inclusion of all parts of Syria and all key constituencies within the political transition process. Mr. President, it is also important to stress that the security landscape remains complex in the rest of Syria too. The caretaker authorities continue to consolidate their presence, including through efforts to build a national army, with widespread support for ensuring that no weapons are held outside of the state. But many groups still exercise some or even significant autonomy. Many Syrians express fears about security fragmentation and fears it could be exploited by external actors, particularly if the transition goes awry. And many expressed parallel concerns that ongoing efforts for public sector restructuring may push hundreds of thousands into need, including former security elements, potentially jeopardizing stability in the future. And, Mr. President, there are further layers of security complexity, especially with the ongoing threats and presence of ISIL, areas of security vacuum, and reports of rising crime rates in some areas. I believe that moving towards the shared goal of stability and a national army will likely be linked to the overall political transition and its credibility and inclusiveness. And let me also clearly appeal to all international stakeholders to maintain a coordinated front in supporting this goal. Let me also add, many Syrians have expressed serious concerns on the inclusion of foreign fighters in the senior ranks of the new armed forces, as well as individuals associated with violations. I also wish to note the visit of an OPCW delegation to Damascus and their meeting with the caretaker authorities. Mr. President, let me note a related challenge, the very concerning reports of incidents still taking place against the backdrop of the authorities' security operations, including men killed in the exchange of fire and reported serious ill treatment in detention. In addition, residents are reportedly facing incidents of kidnapping, looting, expropriation of property, and forced evictions of families from public housing. The caretaker authorities told me plainly that there is no policy of revenge or retribution, and they have reportedly taken some steps to hold to account those responsible. They have also released hundreds of detained persons, but there is still lack of clarity on the due process of those detained, including access of specialized humanitarian organizations to places of detention. And there is a risk of a trend of individual incidents developing into a cycle of retribution and revenge. Mr. President, it is the responsibility of the caretaker authorities to ensure all armed actors cease these kinds of actions, to amplify their assurances into concrete procedures, and also to work on a comprehensive transitional justice framework. Mr. President, the caretaker authorities have made important statements regarding Israel. UNDOF says that the IDF has established multiple positions in the area of separation in violation of the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement. Such facts on the ground are not easily reversed. I appeal to the Security Council to hold Israel to its commitment that this is temporary presence and stress that Israel must withdraw. The UN is engaging Israel and the caretaker authorities to this end. Mr. President, Syrians also impressed on me the urgent need for the international community to help ensure economic stability, particularly with moves on sanctions. The economic challenges are mounting fast, especially with sudden humanitarian donor cuts. Many Syrians will be measuring success in hours of electricity, the price of food, and levels of employment. Sanctioning states should make meaningful moves towards sanctions easing from the outset, including in the critical sectors of energy, investments and finance, including the central bank. I welcome the important decisions and signals from the EU and US in recent weeks, and I hope that these moves can be built upon quickly. I have also conveyed to the caretaker authorities the assessment that, as indicated by sanctioning states, a credible transition will be essential to continuing and expanding positive and bold sanction moves. Syria needs tremendous support in other areas too, including large-scale investments in Syria's recovery, reconstruction, and long-term prosperity. What I hear from key member states who have the capacity to provide such support is their confidence to make such investment will go hand in hand with concrete steps towards an inclusive, transparent transition, as well as reforms to overcome previous corruption and mismanagement, and actions in other areas we have discussed: security, terrorism, and chemical weapons. Mr. President, to conclude, I encourage the caretaker authorities to make good on their commitments to the Syrian people by clear and concrete actions on the transition and in engagement with my office. I encourage the international community to do its part on sanctions and the economy and Syrian sovereignty, all essential to a successful transition too. And I stress that the UN will continue to render its support to the Syrian political transition through the political work and support of my office, and to deliver as one across the full range of the UN family, and to stress the importance of all key international actors working together in a coordinated manner. Mr. President, let us remember that the challenges Syria faces are myriad and immense, including an ongoing conflict, a fragmented security landscape, a battered economy, and a population emerging from 14 years of war in a situation of great hope, but division too. An inclusive, credible, and transparent political transition that is Syrian-owned and Syrian-led, assisted by the United Nations and with the united international community, in line with the key principles of Security Council Resolution 2254, remains the best and only path to addressing these challenges. The Syrian people must finally be given the opportunity to restore their sovereignty, overcome this conflict, determine their future, and realize their legitimate aspirations. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and Assistant Secretary General Joyce Masuya, for your briefings. We appreciate your candid assessments of the political and humanitarian situation in Syria and your continued engagement in Damascus. During Secretary of State Marco Rubio's recent engagements with regional leaders, he has highlighted the need for an inclusive transition in Syria. The United States believes that Council members should continue to urge an expansive representation of Syrian voices in Syria's future. Secretary Rubio has also underscored the need to prevent Syria from becoming a safe haven for terrorism. We want a Syria that denies foreign malign actors the opportunity to exploit Syria's transition for their own objectives. For many years, the Assad regime allowed Iran and its terrorist proxies, including Hezbollah, to use Syrian territory to threaten regional security and traffic dangerous weapons. Now, we are concerned by reports of newly formed groups in Syria that are inciting violence, including by seeking to draw Israel into direct conflict. These groups are reportedly receiving financial and logistical support from Iran, even after Iran's departure from Syria. The warning signs of Iran's nefarious influence and intent to reestablish its presence in Syria are clear. For these reasons, we must collectively call on Iran to stop undermining Syria's stability and security. Ongoing armed hostilities in northern Syria are also concerning, and the United States will continue to pursue a ceasefire that will enable our local partners to focus on combating ISIS and maintain security of detention facilities and displaced person camps. Since the territorial defeat of ISIS, U.S. assistance has played a vital role in managing and securing Al-Hol and Roj displaced person camps in northeast Syria, and critically, Syrian Defense Democratic Forces managed facilities, detaining thousands of ISIS fighters. But this assistance cannot last forever. The United States has shouldered too much of this burden for too long. Ultimately, the camps cannot remain a direct U.S. financial responsibility. We accordingly continue to urge countries to expeditiously repatriate their displaced and detained nationals who remain in the region. We are encouraged by Carla Quintana's visit to Syria, the first such visit by the head of the Independent Institution on Missing Persons in Syria. We encourage close cooperation with the IIMP, including the opening of a IIMP office in Damascus, which will help families of the missing get the answers they have long deserved, including for Americans and partner country nationals. To that end, we also continue to encourage cooperation with the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, IIIM, and Syrian accountability groups. We also took note that the UN received approval to resume deliveries of humanitarian assistance through the Bab al-Hawa crossing, and we will continue to encourage sustained access. We remain in close touch with our allies and partners and emphasize the importance of reaching stability in Syria to make our country and the region more secure. I thank you.
Mr. President, we are grateful to the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for Syria, Geir Pedersen, as well as the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations for Humanitarian Affairs, Joyce Masuya, for their detailed briefings on the situation in the Syrian Arab Republic. We note that the contours of the domestic political landscape in Syria are coming into relief. And although many elements, in order to draw comprehensive conclusions about further prospects of developments here, are not yet within reach, it is clear to all, nevertheless, that the country continues to face major challenges and problems. Furthermore, the tenuous situation that has arisen with clear indications of political uncertainty is something which certain external players have eagerly capitalized on for the advancement of their parochial agendas. For example, Israel, amid the tumult, has completely destroyed military and defense capabilities of Syria and has expanded the area of its occupation in the Golan Heights. These are illegal actions by West Jerusalem. They fly in the face of international law, and there's no justification for this kind of action. Israel has an obligation to immediately withdraw its units from the Syrian territories that are occupied, including Mount Hermon, especially given that Damascus has reaffirmed its commitment to the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement, which establishes conditions for the return of Syrian troops to their posts on the Bravo side. We are also concerned by recent skirmishes on the Syrian-Lebanese border, including with the use of artillery. We call upon both neighboring countries to de-escalate and to resolve problems that arise through dialogue. A key contributing factor to this needs to be achieved through the establishment of channel between the military political leadership in Damascus and Beirut. The Kurdish question remains a pressing issue. We note the ongoing dialogue between the Syrian authorities and the Syrian Democratic Forces. However, we note the fact that the Syrian Democratic Forces, like the Syrian National Army, have not joined the ranks of the Syrian Armed Forces. This inevitably raises concern. It is difficult not to see here alarming indicators of the expansion and deepening of divides along ethnic and religious lines. And these are also reflected in the ongoing persecution of the Alawite minority who are associated with the former government, whereas the provisional authorities in Damascus have publicly spoken out against any extrajudicial reprisals. The internet is replete with videos showing acts of violence against Alawites and other Syrians who are accused of cooperation with the former authorities. Such attempts to supplant legitimate vigilante justice are completely unacceptable. There's a need for the prompt reunification of law enforcement bodies, as well as the return of a state monopoly on the use of force. And lastly, there's a need to bear in mind lessons of the recent past when ill-conceived and short-sighted steps undertaken in post-Saddam Iraq have reinforced ISIL to such an extent that the group has become a grave threat, not just for the region, but for the entire region. We urge the new Syrian authorities to prioritize these issues. There's a need to prevent ISIL and other terrorist groups' promotion of revenge ideology and their promotion of the breakup of Syrian society, and they need to be prevented from exploiting the security vacuum that has arisen. Mr. President, I now turn to the humanitarian situation. Syria continues to experience a dire state of crisis. The economic situation is worsening. 90% of the population lives below the poverty line. And 2.5 million children are unable to attend school, and this is fraught with grave risks related to consequences for the future of the country and the prospects of its sustainable development. We trust that after the Council determines will be penholder for the Syrian humanitarian dossier, we trust that these are issues that will be prioritized. Calls and initiatives of the United Nations Humanitarian Wing to expand the amount of assistance to the Syrian population deserve full support, especially given that opportunities for the establishment of effective mechanisms for the delivery of assistance exist. Humanitarian workers maintain a presence on the ground. Cross-border corridors continue to operate, and United Nations structures do not have grievances vis-à-vis the new Syrian authorities in the context of ensuring broader humanitarian access. I turn to another factor, which has not changed in Syria since last year. That is insufficient financing from the international community, without which results will not be achieved. Owing to a shortage of resources, the food product deliveries have been reduced by 80%, and this is despite the fact that 13 people precisely need food assistance. The consequences of limited financing in northwest Syria have resulted in suspended operations by more than 100 medical institutions, and there are also difficulties with sustainable water deliveries for 600,000 people. The modest levels of humanitarian assistance in Syria are starkly attested to in OCHA reports, which recently refer not to results, not to amounts of humanitarian assistance, but rather they refer to humanitarian needs, assessment missions, and complications and difficulties in ensuring security in certain regions. The new United Nations humanitarian appeal for Syria, planned for the first 3 months of this year, 2025, that is January to March 2025, also do not generate optimism. To date, essentially at the midpoint of this appeal, humanitarian workers have only received 9% of the anticipated resources, merely $112 million. Clearly, this is a drop in the ocean when it comes to alleviating the plight of millions of people in need. Clearly, the main donors' position as they await alongside the persistent sanctions restrictions carried out by the United States and their allies, clearly this is blatantly exacerbating humanitarian problems experienced in Syria. Yet again, we are compelled to reiterate our call for Western colleagues to embrace the imperative of humanity vis-à-vis the Syrian people who are still unable to fully recover from the devastating upheavals. There's a need to abandon the politicized approach which has been applied to the Syrian humanitarian dossier for the past 14 years. And this needs to be reflected not just in increases of assistance being provided, but also in the full lifting of the sanctions which have asphyxiated the Syrian economy. And this needs to be reflected in the lifting of barriers for the launch of projects for the recovery of the country. In this context, we view the decision of a number of countries to ease some of the anti-Syrian restrictive measures that they had previously imposed. We view this as a step in the right direction. Today, when Western capitals no longer even have any fabricated pretext for the maintenance of unilateral sanctions, the time is ripe to abandon confrontational approaches vis-à-vis the Syrian crisis and to consolidate international efforts to help ensure the rebuilding of that country. These efforts need to be inclusive, without any intent to exclude influential players who are in a position to help restore peaceful life in Syria. We continue to believe there's a need and that it is timely to organize what Geir Pedersen has proposed. I refer to the international conference with the participation of all interested Syrian stakeholders and international stakeholders without exclusion. This will help to unite the efforts of external players and help to resolve the Syrian crisis. The United Nations needs to play a key role in supporting the Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, inclusive, political process on the basis of the principles which are enshrined in Security Council Resolution 2254. These include reaffirmation of the provision about the need for respect for Syrian sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and unity, as well as of elections, the result of which will not be disputed. We fully support the relevant efforts undertaken by Special Envoy Pedersen. For our part, we intend to continue to forge bilateral, multi-tiered cooperation with the fraternal nation of Syria and the principles of traditional friendship and mutual respect. The Russian interagency delegation visited Damascus. And today, a telephone conversation will be held between President Putin and the president of the transitional government, al-Shara. Our relations are time-tested, and they do not rely on political calculations. We stand ready to continue to deliver assistance to the Syrians in the post-crisis rebuilding of the country. Thank you.
I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of China. I would like to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and ASG Masuya for their briefings. The Syrian people who have long been mired in sufferings and hardships caused by war and chaos are longing for a return of peace and stability in their country so that they can start a life of tranquility and dignity as soon as possible. At this critical juncture, it is important for the international community to provide constructive assistance to Syria. China supports the promotion of a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process, achievement of a solution that meets the aspirations of all Syrian people through inclusive dialogue and consultations. Resolution 2254 of the Security Council embodies the basic consensus within the international community and provides important guidance for addressing the Syrian issue. It remains valid in terms of the current situation. The holding of a conference of a national dialogue is a key step in the political transition for which a clear timetable should be set as soon as possible and implemented steadily. China supports the active role played by the United Nations and the Special Envoy in this process, as well as the efforts of the Arab League to help Syria in its political transition and reconstruction. Syria must not become a safe haven for terrorists. This is the bottom line that must be adhered to. The latest report of the Secretary-General points out that Syria serves as a center for terrorist activities planning and that by exploiting the recent sudden change of the situation in Syria, terrorist organizations may seek to strengthen their position. The international community should therefore remain highly vigilant in this regard. The protracted presence of large numbers of foreign terrorist fighters in Syria has created a hidden security risk. China supports speeding up the process of repatriation of foreign terrorist fighters and calls on countries concerned to take back their nationals. At the same time, China urges Syria to fulfill its counter-terrorism obligations and to combat all terrorist organizations listed by the Security Council, including the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, also known as the Turkestan Islamic Party, in order to prevent them from threatening the security of other countries. As we just heard from the briefings, the current humanitarian situation in Syria is extremely dire, where it is worrying to see that the survival and the development of tens of millions of people are at stake. China appreciates the efforts of UN agencies to scale up humanitarian assistance to Syria under very difficult conditions. The illegal Unilateral sanctions on Syria imposed by one country has caused great harm to the Syrian people. China's position on this has been consistent in that such measures should not have existed in the first place. In order to meet the needs of humanitarian assistance and the development of Syria, it is necessary to take actions to eliminate the negative impact of these measures. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize that the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria should be respected under all circumstances. The resolution of the Security Council on the Golan must be implemented. So is the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement. China urges Israel to withdraw from Syrian territory without delay. I now resume my function as the President of the Security Council. I give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. I congratulate you and your esteemed delegation on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month. You can rely on our support and our trust in your able leadership of the works of the Council. We also thank the Permanent Mission of Algeria for their successful management of the Council's affairs last month. I express my country's solidarity and sympathy with Greece and its people following the series of earthquakes that struck the Greek island of Santorini, which coincide with the anniversary of the devastating earthquake and its aftershocks that Syria witnessed on these very days 2 years ago. Of course, I would like to thank the Special Envoy, Mr. Geir Pedersen, and the Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Ms. Joyce Msuya, for their briefings. Mr. President, Syria has embarked on a transitional phase that was launched and outlined during the Victory Conference held in Damascus on January 29, 2025. The conference concluded with a set of decisions that mark a new era in Syria's political history, including the abolition of the 2012 constitution and all the exceptional laws, the dissolution of the People's Assembly, the army, all security agencies, the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party, and the parties of the National Progressive Front. It also included the dissolution of all military factions and revolutionary political and civil bodies and their integration into state institutions. The conference also decided to appoint Mr. Ahmed al-Shara as the country's president during the transitional phase to carry out the duties of the presidency and representation of the country at the international level, and to authorize him to form a temporary legislative council to assume the legislative functions until a permanent constitution for the country is ratified and comes into effect. During the transitional phase, work will be undertaken to preserve Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity, to achieve its renaissance through the genuine participation of all Syrians, men and women alike, youth and young women inside and outside the country, to build their future in freedom and dignity without generalization. Work is underway to form a comprehensive transitional government that reflects the diversity and richness of Syria with all its components, men and women. This government will undertake the work of building the new Syria's institutions until such time we reach a stage of free and fair elections. Based on his mandate as President of the country during the transitional phase, the President of the Republic will announce a preparatory committee to select a smaller legislative council to fill the current void. And today, the President has made a declaration to also define the members to the National Dialogue Conference, which will represent a direct platform for deliberation, consultations
نظر
of various viewpoints on the upcoming political program leading up to the constitutional declaration that will determine the identity of the state and the nature of its future regime. It will also be the legal reference for the transitional phase. Accordingly, our focus during the coming period will be on the following priorities. First, achieving civil peace and establishing genuine transitional justice that guarantees the accountability of criminals whose hands have been stained with the blood of Syrians. Second, uniting the Syrian territories, upholding the authority of the state and the rule of law over all its territories, and restrict weapons to the state possession. Third, building strong institutions based on competence, justice, integrity, and participation. Fourth, establishing the foundations of a strong economy that provides real and decent job opportunities to improve living conditions, restore basic services, and embark on the path of development. Mr. President, my government reaffirms its commitment to build friendly relations with all countries based on mutual respect and common interests. It emphasizes that the new Syria will not be a haven for terrorism, nor a source of threat to any country, neighboring countries or around the world. Recently, Syria has witnessed and continues to witness an intense political and diplomatic momentum to inaugurate a new phase premised on strengthening bilateral relations and multilateral relations with regional countries and other UN member states to contribute towards preserving the international peace and security and upholding values of friendly relations and cooperation among member states. This approach has been reflected in Syria's engagement in the multilateral sphere and strengthening the partnership with the United Nations. The Syrian people eagerly look forward to improving humanitarian and living conditions, to providing essential services, primarily electricity, achieving economic recovery, reconstruction, and returning to a path of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. As such, immediate action is necessary to avoid disappointing the Syrian people and to bring about a qualitative shift that meets their aspirations and align with the sacrifices that they have made and the hardships they have endured to build a better Syria by Syrians and for all Syrians. To this end, the Syrian government has demonstrated full openness and has received numerous UN delegations and relevant international bodies to establish a new phase of cooperation in various fields, particularly humanitarian efforts, such as revealing the fate of the missing and forcibly disappeared by the former regime and its security apparatuses, returning the remains of martyrs to their families, and putting an end to the prolonged situation of uncertainty and suffering that they have endured. As part of the ongoing cooperation with OCHA, and you have listened to Ms. Misoya, the Syrian government has renewed the authorization granted to the UN and its specialized agencies to use the Bab al-Hawa crossing for an additional 6-month period until August 7th of this year, to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to all Syrians in need. Mr. President, the past 2 months have witnessed the beginning of the return of numbers of refugees and internally displaced persons to their areas. Yet the dignified and voluntary large-scale return still faces numerous challenges, most notably the extensive damage to infrastructure and public and private properties, as well as the lack of essential services, especially electricity, the lifeline of daily life in most areas, as well as the limited availability of medical and relief resources, the deteriorating economic situation, and the widespread contamination with landmines and explosive remnants. In the light of the enormous needs, humanitarian relief workers are raising the alarm about the lack of funding for humanitarian response in Syria, as by the end of last year, only 34.5% of the 2024 humanitarian response plan had been covered. At this critical moment, the funding is still below expectation, and it is very important in this critical moment in Syria's history that the international community responds effectively to the needs of the Syrian people by increasing its financial and humanitarian support. In parallel with these developments, sanctions remain a major obstacle to economic recovery and the creation of an encouraging environment for the return of the refugees. While Syria welcomes the 6 months exemptions and exceptions issued by the US as well as the European Union's decision to suspend sanctions on several key sectors for 1 year, Syria aspires to the complete lifting of sanctions imposed on the Syrian people that are causing a great damage to
إننا نأمل
aspects of daily life. We are hopeful that the Paris Aqaba III conference to be held tomorrow, that this conference will send an unequivocal message calling for the lifting of these sanctions and supporting Syrians during this pivotal stage in their country's history. Mr. President, the Israeli occupation army continues its assaults on Syria's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity in violation of international law, the UN Charter, relevant UN resolutions, and the 1974 Disengagement Agreement. Israeli occupation forces have unlawfully and without any justification or prior provocation have breached the separation zone and entered dozens of kilometers inside Syrian territory to forcibly control vast areas that are estimated
كيلومترات المربعة
square kilometers of lands in the governorate of Quneitra, Mount Hermon, and the surrounding areas, extending to the governorates of Dar'a and Damascus countryside, rural Damascus. This illegal incursion has been accompanied by Israeli occupation forces attacking the residents of the areas they have entered, confiscating their properties, forcibly displacing and abducting many of them, bulldozing large areas of agricultural land, establishing military points, subjecting civilians to harsh conditions and inhumane practices. They have also constructed military bases and surveillance centers, as well as undertook engineering works that have included the construction of a helicopter landing pad on Mount Hermon. This exposes the false claims promoted by the Israeli occupation authorities regarding the temporary and limited nature of these hostile actions against Syria that are entirely unjustifiable. The Syrian Arab Republic strongly condemns the blatant Israeli aggression against its territory and reiterates its call upon the Security Council to fulfill its responsibilities and take firm and immediate measures to compel Israel to end its occupation of the occupied Syrian Golan and to immediately halt its ongoing aggression against Syrian territory and to unconditionally withdraw from all areas it has forcibly entered, fully adhering to the disengagement agreement and respect the mandates of UNDOF and UNTSO, and ensure the implementation of relevant Security Council resolutions, particularly the resolutions 242, 338, 49.
على التطبيق.
Mr. President, as the Syrian people look forward to turning this page of pain and suffering, they firmly believe that their country possesses the essential elements for revival, most notably the human capital, natural resources, and an unwavering will and determination. They are capable and resolute in making every possible effort to ensure the success of this pivotal phase and to lead the country towards a bright future that befits Syria, its people, its rich civilization and human heritage, while building a state founded on law, justice, and equality. We call upon you to stand by Syria during this critical phase so that together we may move forward towards a better tomorrow,
ويتلافى السيناريو
security and stability in the region, and avoids the bleak scenarios pushed by those who do not wish Syria and its people well. These actors fuel division by spreading hate speech, inciting violence, and sowing divisions, particularly through the misuse of social media platforms. Syria will remain a nation for all its people, taking pride in its rich religious, ethnic, and cultural diversity, free from any divisive terms such as minorities or majorities or any other destructive narratives. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. Now I give the floor to the representative of Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, Mr. President, I extend my heartfelt congratulations to China on assuming the presidency of Security Council this month. I also warmly congratulate Algeria for the successful leadership and its presidency's conclusion in January. We appreciate Mr. Pedersen, the Special Envoy, and Ms. Masuya, the Assistant Secretary General, for their briefing and their support for the UN's constructive engagement with the Syria caretaker authorities to improve the situation in Syria. Mr. President, given the current situation in Syria, I would like to make the following point. First, Syria continues to face significant humanitarian and economic challenges. Addressing these issues requires prioritizing the reconstruction of critical infrastructure and the restoration of essential services, particularly early recovery projects that are vital to the country's rebuilding effort. However, these efforts are severely hindered by the unjust and unlawful extraterritorial sanctions imposed by the US and the EU. Temporary relief from these illegal measures or limited humanitarian exemptions is not a sustainable solution. These measures must be fully lifted as they disproportionately harm the most vulnerable population, violate the fundamental rights of the Syrian people, and obstruct the country's recovery. Equally important, removing these illegal measures is essential to creating the conditions necessary for the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of all Syrian refugees and displaced persons. Second, the resurgence of terrorism in Syria poses escalating and urgent threats. The presence of foreign terrorist fighters with conflicting agenda has exacerbated instability, jeopardizing both regional and global security. As the Undersecretary General of the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism warned in this chamber, the risk that stockpiles of the advanced weapon could fall into the hands of terrorists remains a serious concern. An estimated 42,500 individuals, some with alleged link with Daesh, remains in detention camps in northeastern Syria. A structured, accountable process for repatriation is essential to restoring stability in Syria and the broader region. FTS must be returned to their countries of origin, held accountable through legal proceeding, and prevented from posing further threats. Iran remains firmly committed to combating terrorism and is prepared to cooperate with legitimate international partners to address these critical challenges. Third, the rights of all communities must be fully respected in accordance with international law, and all forms of political pressure and harassment aimed at displacing minorities in Syria, particularly Alevites and Shiites, must cease immediately. Likewise, safeguarding Syrian religious sites is crucial to preserving the country's identity and unity. In this context, all communities must have unrestricted access to their religious places and be able to practice their rituals freely without fear of persecution, intimidation, or arrest. Fourth, Israel remains a serious threat to Syria, repeatedly violating Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity, defying all Security Council resolutions. This regime refused to withdraw from the occupied Golan Heights. With U.S. support, Israel has expanded its occupation and systematically dismantled Syria's military and research infrastructure. The Security Council must take decisive action to stop these violations and compel Israel to withdraw from all occupied Syrian territories. Fifth, Iran once again reaffirms its unwavering commitment to Syrian sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity. The future of Syria must be determined solely by its people, free from any external interference or imposition. Iran supports the formation of an exclusive government through free election and comprehensive national dialogue, ensuring fair representation for all Syrians. Resolution 2254 provides a clear framework with constitutional reform as a key priority. Furthermore, Iran underscores Syria's rightful and deserved place in the international community, emphasizing its commitment to international and bilateral obligation while safeguarding its sovereignty. Sixth, we categorically and unequivocally reject the baseless allegation made by the representative of the United States against my country. These accusations are not only unfounded, but appear to be crafted solely to distort the truth and reality on the ground and mislead the international community. Regrettably, such claims are neither surprising nor unexpected. They are only the product of directives from Washington, which finds it necessary to accuse Iran at every Security Council meeting. However, the facts speak for themselves. For many years, under the pretext of counterterrorism, the United States has repeatedly violated Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity and provided safe haven for terrorist groups and the occupying regime of Israel to further its geopolitical ambitions. In conclusion, Mr. President, Iran remains dedicated to playing a constructive role, working in coordination with the United Nations, regional partners, and the Syrian government, which represents the will of the Syrian people, to achieve lasting peace and stability in Syria and the broader region. In this context, we fully support the efforts of UN Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and stress that the United Nations must play a central role in this process. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Iran. I give the floor to the representative of Qatar.
Thank you, Mr. President. We congratulate you on presiding over the Security Council this month. We align ourselves with the statement of the Arab group. We thank Mr. Geir Pedersen, the Special Envoy, and Ms. Joyce Misuya, the Deputy Emergency Relief Coordinator, for their comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, the state of Qatar is proud of its firm position over the past 13 years, standing with our Syrian brothers and sisters, and our firm support to their calls for dignity, freedom, and social justice. Following the victory of the revolution, Qatar's firm position led to the resumption of our close fraternal ties with Syria. The official visit by His Highness Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the Emir of the State of Qatar, on the 30th of January to the Syrian capital was the first visit of a head of state following the historic change. He congratulated him on the victory of the Syrian revolution and choosing him as a president of the transitional period, reaffirming Qatar's support of the unity, sovereignty, and independence of Syria. We welcome the positive steps taken by the new Syrian administration to protect civilians of state institutions, the provision of public services, and meeting the necessary needs of the Syrian people. We also welcome the steps taken to reconstruct the Syrian state to promote unity among all Syrian components, paving the way towards civil peace, security, stability, and building a state of institutions, rule of law, and development. These steps represent the start of a new era, allowing the Syrian people to achieve their legitimate aspirations to freedom, justice, and peace. The current phase also requires state monopoly over arms through one army reflecting all the components of Syria with no exclusion to protect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria. The Syrian brotherly people has made immense sacrifices and deserves today the acknowledgement and support of the international community to their national project. Based on our moral responsibility towards our brothers in Syria to improve their humanitarian and living conditions, the state of Qatar established an air bridge to deliver humanitarian assistance. To this day, 13 military planes with 378 tons of assistance were sent. The state also committed to providing technical support to reoperationalize infrastructure, including the electricity sector. This will improve the situation in more than 10 Syrian areas. Recently, Al-Amal city in North Syria was opened. This is a residential project for the displaced with the sponsorship of Qatar and Turkey that has essential services facilities. The current humanitarian situation requires the promotion of collective international efforts to promote humanitarian assistance and ensure their unhindered delivery to affected areas. We call for lifting sanctions because they negatively affect the Syrian people. The reasons for which they were imposed are gone. We note the statement adopted at the 46th extraordinary meeting of the GCC Ministerial Council on the situation in Syria, adopted on 26 December, calling for lifting the sanctions to empower Syria economically. It also called upon all partners, states, and organizations to provide all the support necessary to Syrians, stressing that the GCC will continue to provide humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, in conclusion, we condemn the Israeli occupation's takeover of the buffer zone with sisterly Syria and neighboring areas. This is a dangerous development and a blatant violation on the sovereignty and unity of Syria. It is a blatant violation of international law. We warn against the policy of fait accompli adopted by the Israeli occupation because it will further violence and tension in the region. We stress the need for the international community to shoulder its moral and legal responsibility to compel the occupation to abide by the resolutions of international legitimacy and relevant Security Council resolutions. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Qatar. I give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.